Hey everyone, welcome to this explainer. Today we're popping the hood and looking at the absolute engine of American democracy. We're going to unpack exactly how the US election system works, step by step. Plus, we're going to look at how you, as a future voter, can cut through all the noise to evaluate the massive amount of information out there so you can make the best possible decisions. Basically, we're getting you the tools you need to really understand your government and, more importantly, actively participate in it.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our cognitive roadmap for today. We'll look at the role of political parties, nominations and primary elections, and the general election. Then we'll hit voter registration and turnout, how to evaluate evidence-based claims, and finish up with a quick recap and transfer.
Starting us off with Section 1, the role of political parties. So, to really get the electoral timeline, we've got to understand the organizations actually running the candidates, right? What even is a political party? Well, we can make a pretty clear claim here. Political parties are the primary vehicle for candidate selection in the United States. And the evidence? Our two-party system is quite literally structured from the bottom up to manage this exact process. Sure, minor parties have popped up and made an impact here and there, but the evidence shows that electoral rules, like plurality voting, have basically helped consolidate our system into two main parties since way back in 1860.
You can kind of think of a political party like a giant ladder. Down at the very bottom rung, the local level, like your county or precinct, that's where the party's mobilizing your neighbors and registering voters. Then as you climb higher up to the state and national levels, that's where they're shaping the big picture ideas and the overall party ideology. And finally, when their candidate climbs all the way up into office, the party in government gets to work actually implementing the policies they campaigned on in the first place. So the whole shebang is built to help candidates get elected and then govern.
Moving right along to Section 2, nominations and primary elections.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how a party actually chooses which candidate gets to represent them on the final ballot. This is the very first chronological step in the election cycle. Notice the clear distinction between the two phases of an election year. At the start of the year, we've got the primary or caucus phase. State political parties choose to hold either primaries, which use fast private ballots, or caucuses, which are more like informal public gatherings. This is where multiple candidates from the exact same party compete against each other. The general election happens later on. That's when the winning nominees from each party finally face off against one another to win the actual office.
All right, time for our first pause check. I want you 8th graders to pause the explainer right here, think about it, and test your memory. Which election determines the party's nominee? Okay, got your answer? Let's check it.
So, if you said the primary or caucus, you are absolutely correct. The immediate reasoning here is that the primary is just the first step. When voters cast their ballots in a primary or gather together in a caucus, they're actually selecting delegates. Those delegates then pack up and travel to state or national conventions to formally vote and finalize the party's nominee. Historically, party leaders kept pretty tight control over these conventions, but today, primary voting brings that power directly to the people.
Which brings us to Section 3, the general election.
Once those conventions wrap up, we are into the main event. Let's walk through this timeline chronologically. The cycle kicks off with the primary or caucus, moves to the state or national convention where the nominee is crowned, and then comes the general election. This phase is heavily focused on convincing undecided voters and making sure party members actually get to the polls. Election day itself takes place in early November. But, and this is a really critical fact for presidential races, voters on election day aren't directly electing the president. Nope, they're actually choosing electors. It's the Electoral College that formally elects the president a few weeks later, right around mid-December.
All right, Section 4, voter registration and turnout. Now let's shift gears a bit from the candidates to the citizens themselves. How do voters get ready for Election Day? And honestly, how many actually show up? Imagine a runner trying to finish a race, but there's a huge hurdle right in the middle of the track. Let's look at this using a clear claim evidence structure. The claim here is that voter registration hurdles directly impact voter turnout. Makes sense, right? If it's hard to register, fewer people finish the race to vote. The evidence for this lies in how the federal government has actually responded to try and clear that track. For instance, the National Voter Registration Act requires states to add voter registration to government applications, making it way easier to sign up. Plus, the Help America Vote Act requires states to maintain accurate voter rolls. So, while the specific rules do vary by state, making registration easier generally gives a massive boost to participation.
So the crucial point is how we actually go about measuring voter turnout. If you calculate turnout as a percentage of the voting age population, which literally just means everyone old enough to vote, it often looks like barely half of citizens participate. However, when we look at turnout as a percentage of people who are actually registered to vote, the number jumps dramatically to 87%.
That's huge. It proves that once a citizen overcomes that initial hurdle of registering, they're highly likely to actually cast their ballot.
Moving on to Section 5, evaluating evidence-based claims. We've talked a lot about the mechanics of voting, but once a voter actually has their ballot in hand, how do they decide? In a world just totally flooded with campaign ads and social media noise, media literacy is absolutely essential. The C3 framework for social studies gives us a really powerful standard here. It asks students to evaluate arguments and claims in a text, given the relevance and sufficiency of the evidence. You see, social studies is an evidence-based field. To be an active, responsible citizen, you've got to know how to separate factual, evidence-based claims from parochial, completely unsupported opinions. You can't just believe every single thing a candidate says on TV or on your feed. You have to evaluate the evidence.
Let's move to and see how this builds into an actionable, real-world process. First up, you gather sources and assess their credibility. Keep in mind, not all sources are created equal. You have to consider the background and the intent of where the information is coming from. Next, you analyze the claims and counterclaims. You've got to look at what a politician is claiming and then actively seek out the counterclaims so you can see the whole picture. And finally, you construct your own evidence-based argument before you cast your vote.
Okay, time for our second pause check. Pause the explainer right here. Based on what we just talked about with the C3 framework, how do you identify strong versus weak evidence when evaluating a policy claim? Really think about the specific words we used. All right, got it? Let's break it down.
The immediate reasoning is exactly this. Strong evidence relies on the relevance and sufficiency of factual knowledge. That basically means the evidence actually matters to the specific claim being made, and there's enough of it to prove the point. Weak evidence, on the flip side, relies on totally unsupported opinions, emotional appeals, or claims that just lack any credible factual backing. Keeping this distinction in mind is literally your ultimate shield against misinformation.
And finally, Section 6, recap and transfer. We have covered a ton of ground today, from the foundation of political parties all the way to evaluating complex policy claims. So let's do a rapid recap. We learned that political parties are structured to shape ideology at the top and mobilize voters at the bottom to get candidates elected. We saw that the electoral timeline flows chronologically, starting from local primaries and caucuses, moving to conventions, then the general election, and finally landing at the Electoral College. We discovered that voter turnout is heavily impacted by state registration rules, and that registered voters have a massive turnout rate of 87%. And absolutely crucial here, we learned that informed voters must evaluate political claims by looking for credible, relevant, and sufficient evidence. Now, I want to leave you with a final thought to take with you beyond this explainer. Think about your own city, your town, or your school district. How can you use this exact claim evidence process to evaluate a proposed law or policy right in your own community? The next time you hear a local leader propose a new rule, don't just blindly accept it. Ask for the evidence, analyze the counterclaims, and construct your own argument. Because democracy isn't just something you watch, it's something you actively do. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep asking great questions.